So if you've been with this channel for a while now, you're probably quite familiar with the ideals and philosophies of all 5 of the colors of Magic the Gathering. You probably remember when we brought those colors together into pairs, and in turn, learned what new philosophies are created from their combinations. A lot of you are probably thinking, well, what's the next step in MTG color philosophy for this channel? Well, I think it's finally time to start the series that I get asked about all the time in the comment sections of my color theory videos. That's right, it's finally time we talk about wedges and shards. So as a primer for you newer players and veteran players alike, I've put this video together to teach you what exactly these terms mean, their history, and how we can learn to decipher them. If you do want to learn about what exactly each of the shards and wedges philosophies are, then make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we'll be tackling each one in future videos. Now, before we can learn about what shards and wedges are, I think it's important to go back to where multicolored cards began. For that, we'll have to go back to the summer of 1994. Ace of Base was on top of the charts, and Magic the Gathering was about to publish its 7th set, Legends. So up until this point in the game's life, every card had consisted of only one color, and even activated effects stayed within the same color as the summoning cost. That wouldn't last forever though, as everything would finally change with the set Legends. In it, the Magic team would introduce us to something that we take for granted to this day. This would be the beginning of Magic the Gathering's use of multicolored cards. What's more is that the multicolored cards of Legends wouldn't just be dual colored. This set would also give us our first taste of what would eventually be called shards. Unfortunately, it would take much longer before we would see anything even resembling wedges. This first rendition of shards, which wouldn't be referred to as such until Shards of Alara in 2008, were merely a grouping of allied colors, with 5 possible combinations in total. This was best represented at the time by the 5 Elder Dragons of the set: Arcades, Chromium, Palladium Moor, Vivictus, and of course, Nicol Bolas. Multicolored cards would be something that would come and go over the years, with some sets sprinkling in a few, while others deciding to leave them out. Multicolored cards, as well as the early version of shards, became something that players latched onto pretty quick, and it would be a popular concept until present day. But there was still something missing. We had pairs and shards in every possible combination. Where were wedges? Well, wedges as we know them today wouldn't come into the game until the set Khans of Tarkir, but this wouldn't be the first place that players would be introduced to wedges. That would actually be in the year 2000 with the invasion block. So before we can arrive in Tarkir, we'll have to make one stop along the way, to the plane of Dominaria, 6 years after Legends. The invasion block consisted of 3 sets: Invasion, Planeshift, and Apocalypse. It was in the invasion block that the MTG design team had decided to craft 3 sets that prominently focused on multicolored cards as their primary identity. The first 2 sets once again gave us a taste for shards with its 5 legendary dragons, Crosis, Drigaz, Dromar, Rith, and Triva, which would be a callback to the Elder Dragons of Legends, who represented shards back then. It wouldn't be until we got to the end of the block with the set Apocalypse that the Magic the Gathering would finally introduce the community to the idea of wedges, with cards like Fervent Charge, Guided Passage, Lightning Angel, Overgrown Estate, and Fungal Shambler. Now, even though the first wedge-based cards would finally be introduced, the players wouldn't really gravitate to those card names when referring to wedges, probably due to the fact that those names were so all over the place and didn't really roll off the tongue. What players would actually call wedge-based decks until the Clans of Tarkir was actually based off of a cycle that wasn't multicolored cards, but instead had the activated mana cost of their enemy colors. This cycle of cards, known as the Volver cycle, as well as their companion cards, would be the names used for wedges for some time. Those names were Anna, Seta, Dega, Raka, and Nekra. So now the mana bases were set, and the idea of bringing every possible combination of mana together was solidified in the players' minds. There was still something missing though, when thinking about our modern view of the color pie. You see, during this time period, multicolored cards, and the colors of Magic in general, didn't really have much of an identity outside of superficial connections, such as elves were green, dwarves were red, and mages were blue. Over the years though, due in great part to the work of Mark Rosewater, the 5 colors of Magic the Gathering would finally begin to form their own solid identities, something that would become an integral part of developing new worlds and factions. It wouldn't be until the set Shards of Alara in 2008 that the idea of shards would truly be given its modern definition and form. Lead designer of Shards of Alara, Bill Rose, set up 5 teams, each given their own combination of 3 allied mana. They then were set to task, discovering the identities of each of the 5 shards. They would use a method wherein they would look at the group of 3 mana that made up the shard and think about what a world would look like without the mana that was missing. It was because of this set that we received the first philosophical identities of the 5 shards, as well as their names. It would take another 6 years though, with the set Cons of Tarkir in 2014, for wedges to get the same treatment. But once that set released, the players finally had an example of what the identities of each of the wedges could be, and in turn, a complete picture of the color pie. Now, at this point, it's safe to say that we're all familiar with how we got to where we are today with wedges and shards. And through the cards we looked at, you probably have an idea of what shards and wedges look like. But this still leaves us with the next question. What exactly are shards and wedges? We know that these are the names given to groupings of 3 colors, but what exactly does that look like, and how are they formed? Well, let's start things off with shards. A shard has one primary color that is then combined with its 2 allies. The primary color gives the shard its focus, with the allied colors influencing it. So, as an example of a shard, we could have red as the core. We would then group it with the colors on the pie that are adjacent to it, which would be green and black, its allied colors. This would then give us the shard Jund. Wedges work in a similar fashion, except instead of combining the colors adjacent to the primary source, you would instead add the enemy colors. So as an example, if we take the same red mana source and then instead add its enemies, which are white and blue, we would get the wedge Jeskai. Okay, so now you have an idea of how these mana sources come together, but what does their merger mean? How do we find out what new philosophies are created from their grouping? When it comes to shards, it's a matter of finding out what the 2 colors being added to the core color have in common with each other. Now, this may sound a little tricky, but in the end, the key is the primary color's ideals, as it is quite literally the color that bridges the gap between the 2. Now, when it comes to wedges, things get a little bit more difficult, as we cannot use the bridge method. Now the trick becomes the difficult task of finding out what new philosophies lie within colors that are usually at odds with each other. But hey, as we found out in the Duality series, this is not impossible. The method then is changed into a question of what the particular wedge is not. What I mean is, what does the missing mana tell us about each wedge's combination? This is a method that was originally used to figure out what each of the shards of Alara would look like, and as such is an alternative method for learning about the shard philosophies, but also for wedges as well. As to what exactly these philosophies are, well, that's something for my future series on wedges and shards. So, like I said at the top, if that is something that interests you, then make sure to sub to the channel. That way we can learn together what ideals and philosophies each tricolor combination is comprised of. Okay, so we've learned the history and a basis for understanding what wedges and shards are and how they can be deciphered, but there's still one thing missing from the equation. We learned everything there is to know about wedges, but we never stopped to ask, what are each of the 5 shards and 5 wedges of modern Magic the Gathering? Well, let's start things off with learning who each of the shards are. First up, with green at its core and white and red as its allies, we have Naya, represented by cards like Zakam, Primal Calamity, and Marisi, Breaker of the Coil. Next up, with red as the base, mixed with its allies black and green, you get Jund, represented by the cards Adun Oakenshield and Hellkite Overlord. Now we have my personal favorite shard, Grixis, which has black as its main color with blue and red allied with it. Grixis is represented by cards such as the OG Nicol Bolas, and of course you can't forget Nicol Bolas. The 4th shard is a combination of white, black, and blue, with blue being the primary, which is known by the name Esper. This shard is represented by cards such as Urtai the Corrupted and Zur the Enchanter. The final shard is based on blue mana, combined with its allies green and white. This is the Shard of Bant, and is represented by the cards Tamio Field Researcher and Estrid the Mask. Okay, so there we have it, the 5 shards of Magic the Gathering. But what are the 5 wedges? Well, let's start things off with my favorite, which is Mardu, which has white as its core. Now, since this is a wedge, we won't be adding its allied mana sources, but instead, we'll look to what its 2 enemies are, which are black and red. Mardu is represented by cards such as Kali of the Vast and Butcher of the Horde. Next up, comprised of blue mana as the primary and red and green as its enemies, we have Tamir. This combination is represented by cards such as Maelstrom Wanderer and Serric Dragonclaw. Our third wedge has green at its center, with its enemy colors being blue and black. This wedge is referred to as Sultai, and is represented by cards such as Muldrotha, the Gravetide, and Sidisi, Blood Tyrant. With red at its core and blue-white as its enemies, we have Jeskai. This wedge is represented by the cards Narset of the Ancient Way and Ruhan of Formori. Now we come to the final wedge, Abzan. Abzan is comprised of black mana at its base and green and white as its enemies. This wedge is represented by cards such as Carador, Ghost Chieftain, and Nethroi, Apex of Death. Shards and wedges have a long history of incremental iteration, especially when talking about wedges, which took a long time to truly form. Because of this, there isn't as wide a variety of examples in the game as there are for dual-colored cards. Yet, we know through the factions who introduced us to these concepts that there is a philosophy to uncover. By taking the core color of its identity and adding the ideals of its partners, we can begin to form a new philosophy. So, with the methods that we have put in place, we will be able to uncover what exactly makes each group tick. So stay tuned to the future of the series as we'll be learning together what philosophies and ideals make up each of the shards and wedges of Magic the Gathering. Hey, thanks for joining me as we took a slice of the Magic the Gathering pie. You are excited as I am for shards and wedges, then make sure you subscribe to the channel as those videos will be coming out in the near future. If you haven't checked it out already, I do have an official DiceTry website at www.dicetry.com, so be sure to check that out because I'm posting new articles all the time. Alright, with that, I'll catch you all in the multiverse. Bye.